Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode number 268, The Usher Family. Constance Ada Elizabeth Usher and her sister Beatrice Cottier Usher were quite well known in musical and theatre circles in Australia in the early 1900s. Their father, Alfred Samuel Usher, was born on the 1st of June 1852 at Shackerwell in London, England. Alfred immigrated to Sydney in 1858 aboard the Castilian as a young child with his family. He was the son of Alfred Ralph Brandon Usher, an English carpenter who'd arrived in Melbourne in 1857. Alfred married Elizabeth Ada Franklin on the 22nd of May 1884 in Camden, New South Wales. Elizabeth was 13 years younger than him. Elizabeth was a descendant of convicts. They raised their children in a middle-class household in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, particularly in Randwick and Waverley, steeped in artistic pursuits. Alfred and Elizabeth's involvement in local music scenes, Alfred being a member of the Royal Sydney Liedertafel Choral Society, and Elizabeth as a performer, provided an early immersion in musical environments. Alfred and Elizabeth hyphenated one of Alfred's middle names with his surname, so they became known as Mr. and Mrs. Brandon Usher, and that is how the children generally were referred to as well. In the 1913 census in Waverley, Alfred is listed as Alfred Samuel Brandon Usher, and he's working as a salesman, with Elizabeth Brandon Usher, domestic duties, and Beatrice Cottier Brandon Usher as an actress. Alfred died on the 11th of September 1915 in Randwick. The Maitland Daily Mercury outlined his death. Mr. Alfred Usher, who started his business career with Elvie & Company and continued it with 33 years of service in a position of trust with W.H. Paling's Music Warehouse, passed away after a few days' illness from pneumonia at a private hospital in Randwick late on Saturday afternoon. The deceased was 63 years of age and widely esteemed in musical circles for his kindly and unselfish disposition. He was one of the oldest members of the Royal Sydney Liedertafel, which was a traditional German singing society, and sang with them at the brilliant send-off concert to Mrs. Armstrong, Mademoiselle Melba, in 1885, and in 1889 he was with that choir when it assisted the Philharmonic in the memorable Charles Saintly performance of Elijah. His wife, Mrs. Brandon Usher, was away visiting her daughter, Mrs. Gilchrist, in Western Australia at the time of his death. His only other daughter, the wife of Commander Bakey Simpson, R.N.R., was also absent, as she has settled with her husband in Yokohama, Japan, some weeks back. Elizabeth Brandon Usher died in Paddington, New South Wales, in 1937 at the age of 67. So now to their quite famous daughters of the time. The firstborn was Constance Ada Elizabeth Brandon Usher, who was born on the 13th of April 1885 in Sydney. She displayed an early musical aptitude, particularly being a prodigious talent for piano, and by the mid-1890s, Constance had begun performing at private functions in Sydney. On the 30th of December 1895 in the Sydney Herald, she features as part of Miss Colburn Baber's concert, and this concert was given by the pupils of Miss Colburn Baber and Mr. Harrison White. This occurred at the Oddfellows Temple. The concert as a whole was played being a veritable tour de force. Miss Connie Usher, a pupil of tender years, displayed a firm touch in Grieg's Elblenblatt and Spinder's Butterfly. Miss Connie Usher's piano playing was much in advance of her years and gave good promise for the future. So this was when she was only 10 years old. On the 8th of July 1896 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, a concert, the first of a series arranged by St Matthias's Parochial Council in Paddington, was given in the local parish hall. The program was excellently carried out and comprised of songs by Mrs. Flo Chapman, Connie Usher, DeRoy and Chapman. On the 5th of January 1897 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, a musical afternoon. The first of a series of musical afternoons in connection with the Society of Artists Art Union was given yesterday at the Temperance Hall. This was Mrs. Alfred Usher's day. There was a good attendance and first-class music, including Miss Connie Usher playing Kowalski's Solitude. Then on the 12th of March 1897 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, a concert was given at the Mariners Church and Institute on Tuesday night with an excellent program of songs, recitations and dances, and one of those performing was Miss Connie Usher. On the 6th of May 1897 in the Sydney Morning Herald, military afternoon. There was a large and fashionable attendance at the Society of Artists exhibition yesterday. Miss Connie Usher played Lizette's Regatta Veneziana with acceptance. And on the 20th of October 1897 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it advertised the Society of Artists Fine and Applied Arts exhibition in Pitt Street, and Mrs. Usher was one of the hostesses, with a musical program that included Connie Usher. On the 30th of October 1897 in the Australian Town and Country Journal in Sydney, Mrs. Alfred de Lisser gave a very enjoyable at-home at the rooms of the Society of Artists. An admirable program of entertainment had been prepared by the hostess, which included a pianoforte duet by Miss Connie Usher and Miss Gladys de Lisser, and instrumental numbers by Miss C. Usher on the piano. Her skills advanced sufficiently that by 1898, to prompt community recognition, it culminated in a benefit concert at the Sydney Town Hall on the 7th of May. It was organised under vice-regal patronage by the Sydney Liedertafel and leading local artists to fund her impending overseas studies. During this farewell event, the 13-year-old Connie earned acclaim by her interpretive sympathy, technical brilliance, and evidence of solid preparatory training in Australia. It also highlighted the family's resolve, backed by Sydney musical circles, to provide Connie with an advanced education at the Leipzig Conservatorium in Germany, and she departed shortly after the age of 12 to study there. The benefit was outlined in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 9th of May 1898. There was a fairly large audience at the Town Hall on Saturday night when a benefit concert was tendered to Miss Connie Usher. The object of the entertainment was to assist the promising young artiste to complete her musical studies in Europe. Miss Usher played Chopin's Nocturne in F sharp and bracketed with it the same composer's Valse in D flat. In the first item, she displayed a remarkable sympathy with the composition, and although the waltz requires brilliancy and finished technique to make it successful as a concert piece, the promising young pianist was warmly applauded for her execution of it. There was no lack of bouquets and baskets of flowers to mark the appreciation of the audience. At the conclusion of the entertainment, Miss Connie Usher played a prelude in C-sharp minor by Rachmaninoff, in the execution of which she displayed as a student remarkable ability and the effect of a good training. On the 10th of December 1898 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it says a letter recently received from Leipzig gives some interesting news of little Miss Connie Usher. There are a great number of American and English students at the Conservatorium, and they all speak of Connie Usher as the talented little Australian girl. Herr Techmuller, under whom she is studying the piano, says she has a wonderful amount of intelligence and will make a great artiste. She has had a splendid educational privilege in attending the celebrated Gewandhaus concerts, where there is a magnificent orchestra. She also heard there the prima donna Sembrek, concertmeister Felix Barber, violinist, Sapelnikov, the St. Petersburg pianist, and Hugo Beecher, the cellist. And on the 7th of January 1899 in Sydney, it says Mr. Alfred S. Usher receives good news this week of his daughter's progress at the Leipzig Conservatorium, which has been so satisfactory that she'll be allowed to appear on the platform soon after Easter. On the 18th of May 1901, in the Perth Daily News, Miss Connie Usher, the pianist who's been studying in Leipzig for the past 3 years, expects to shortly make her debut in London. It is Miss Usher's intention to settle in Sydney later on. On the 20th of February 1902, there's an article that's announcing Connie's performances in Germany. Miss Constance Brandon Usher, a pianist from Sydney, is now pursuing her musical studies at Leipzig. Writing from that city on the 9th of January to her husband in Sydney, Mrs. Alfred S. Usher said, "You will remember that Connie was to have played at the Duke of Saxe-Altenburg's Hof concert this winter, so I wrote inquiring the date and received a reply stating it would be impossible for Miss Usher to appear at the concert on account of the very strong feeling against the British, and especially against British Australians, for the cruelties committed by their soldiers in South Africa, and that if she were to appear there, it would be a very strong feeling against her, and there would possibly be a great disturbance." So I wrote that not on any account would I allow her to appear now, and that being an Englishwoman and very proud of the fact, I was both pained and surprised to find that educated people of so exalted a station in life could be so narrow-minded and that even if cruelties had been committed, which I could not for one moment believe, for no Englishman has ever been known to be cruel to a fellow foe, what had a young girl of 16 to do with the matter? A few months later, in the Melbourne Australian, it says Mrs. Usher with her two daughters will come to London from Germany in a few days. The elder girl, Miss Connie Usher, who's made great progress with her piano studies, has just made a successful appearance at Leipzig. The family intend to remain in London for the season, and it's probable the young pianist will endeavour to obtain an appearance here. Her dedication paid off. She received several prestigious awards, including a scholarship, the Helbig Prize, and the Chief Prize in 1902, a distinction not previously awarded to an English, American or Australian student since 1861. She also earned the Conservatorium's Diploma of Honour and Merit that year, marking the culmination of her training before returning to Australia in late 1902 after approximately 5 years of study. So once returning to Australia, she gave her first post-Europe recital at the Centenary Hall in November 1902, where she was warmly received for her interpretations of works by Bach, Liszt and others, highlighting her technical skill and musical insight that she gained abroad. This marked a significant moment in elevating piano performance standards in colonial Australia, as her technical mastery and program choices bridged European sophistication with the burgeoning local scene. Her professional debut as a mature artist came with a major recital at St James's Hall on May 4, 1904. It drew a crowded audience and marked a significant step in her Sydney career. The program featured challenging solo pieces, including Beethoven's Appassionata Sonata, for which she received enthusiastic applause and a bouquet of flowers, Chopin's Bassoes, MacDowell's Elephantines, Liszt's Tarantella Venezia et Napoli, and Mossowski's Caprice Espagnole. She also performed encores, including Jensen's Morning Breezes. Contemporary reviews praised her careful study and velvety touch, noting the event's success in showcasing her versatility. Throughout the early 1900s, she appeared in various Sydney venues, solidifying her reputation as a leading local pianist through consistent performances that blended classical repertoire with contemporary appeal. Building on her training, it established her as a gifted young pianist in the press, with audiences appreciating her command of complex works. She also collaborated in ensemble pieces, including duo piano arrangements with fellow musicians, which contributed to Sydney's vibrant classical music scene. On the 26th of August 1907 in the Daily Telegraph in Sydney, Society of Artists exhibition at Queen Victoria Markets, and Connie Usher is listed as part of the musical program. Constance married Lieutenant Edward Bakey Simpson, a British naval officer in the Royal Navy Reserve, on the 9th of April 1908 at St Mary's Church in Waverley, New South Wales. On the 15th of April 1908 in the Sydney Mail and New South Wales Advertiser, it had an article on the wedding. Simpson Bakey Brandon Usher. The wedding of Miss Constance Brandon Usher, elder daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Brandon Usher of Rocklands, Waverley, with Mr. E.D. Simpson Bakey, R.N.R., of the Japanese steamer Yawata Maru, was celebrated at St Mary's Church in Waverley on the 9th of April. The bride is well known in musical circles and wore an extremely pretty gown of soft white satin, trimmed with lace and silver tassels, with a tulle veil over a wreath of orange blossoms. The bridesmaids were Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher and Miss Adams from Wahroonga. They established their family home at Rocklands. Connie played a key role in promoting Australian composers, particularly through premieres and dedicated performances of works by Alfred Hill, a leading nationalist figure, blending romantic styles with local themes. A highlight of her collaborative work came on the 6th of July 1908 when she partnered with violinist Cyril Monk for the premiere of Alfred Hill's Violin Sonata No. 3 at the YMCA Hall in Sydney. This performance, part of a broader concert program, highlighted the duo's synergy. Critics noted the seamless interplay between Usher's precise accompaniment and Monk's expressive violin lines, marking the sonata's debut as a significant moment in local chamber music. In Connie's mid-career, it also featured acclaimed accompaniments for vocalists, such as her 1906 collaboration with singer Miss Norell in recitals featuring Lieder and other songs. By 1910, press accounts frequently referred to her as the brilliant Sydney pianist, reflecting her consistent involvement in high-profile events that elevated Australian musical culture. On the 15th of January 1910, in the Australian paper for Australian people in Sydney, 4 Sydney Beauties. Well placed amongst the interesting and beautiful women of Sydney is Mrs. Simpson Bakey, née Miss Constance Brandon Usher, our brilliant Australian pianist and the elder daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Brandon Usher, whose name can be associated with many successful charity functions during the few years the public have had the pleasure of hearing that talented young lady officiating so ably at the piano on our leading concert platforms. She is the daughter of that popular concert manager, Mr. Brandon Usher of Palings, and sister of Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher, also of talented theatrical and musical fame. Unfortunately, since her marriage, Mrs. Simpson Bakey has been professionally lost to the public. They had a daughter, Joyce Constance Dorothy Simpson Bakey, in 1910. She continued to perform in notable concerts, such as in May 1915 at an event at the Sydney Town Hall, alongside artists including Miss Ella Caspers and Mr. Lawrence Campbell. She then shifted towards teaching and co-directing a recital of her students with Mrs. Percy Bates at St James's Hall in May 1915, which highlighted her growing role in musical education amid her personal commitments. On the 27th of October 1911 in the Sydney Sun, it announced that Lieutenant Simpson Bakey, late Chief Officer of the steamer St Albans, has been appointed Captain of the Eastern. Lieutenant Bakey is a highly popular officer and is much esteemed by his management, fellow officers and passengers. He is married to a talented Sydney pianist, Miss Connie Usher, and her many friends will be glad of the news of her husband's promotion to the command of the Eastern. On the 6th of February 1912 in the Sydney Sun, Mrs. Simpson Bakey, Miss Connie Usher, the favourite pianist, who a month ago was reported to be making a satisfactory recovery from a severe attack of pleurisy, was unfortunate enough to suffer a relapse. She developed pneumonia and has during the past 3 weeks been extremely ill. Her medical advisor has ordered her a sea trip and he hopes she will be sufficiently recovered to sail for Tasmania on the 14th of February. In late 1915 they relocated to Yokohama, Japan. A son, William Magnus Simpson Bakey, was born on the 27th of February 1917 in Japan. On the 15th of April 1917 in the Sydney Sun, it says Mrs. Simpson Bakey, Connie Usher, the Sydney pianist, sends news and greetings from Yokohama. There seems to be the musical mainstream among the Europeans. Her latest big effort was the arranging of war fund concerts. These were under the auspices of the Japan branch of the Navy League and the patronage of the British Embassy. The favourite pianist gathered singers and instrumentalists from far and near, very happy musical evenings resulting. On the 9th of March 1919 in the Sydney Sun, George Rex visited Yokohama and met Mrs. Simpson Bakey in her drawing room. She is the wife of the popular captain who used to have his deck lounge on the bridge of the E&A boat plying between here and up there. Constance has achieved special war work, organising entertainments, raising funds and generally keeping the Union Jack flying at a time when it is essential that it be kept well nailed to the mast. Her operetta, All at Sea, her own composition produced by her and running for weeks at a Yokohama playhouse, netted a fine sum, besides enhancing her reputation as a music maker extraordinary. Mrs. Brandon Usher visits her daughter this month, leaving Sydney by the next Japanese mail steamer, and will sojourn northwards with several months yet to be. On the 18th of December 1921 in the Sydney Sun, said the Captain and Mrs. E. Simpson Bakey, the latter remembered in Sydney before her marriage as Connie Brandon Usher, a brilliant pianist, are going to Europe for a 6-month holiday from Yokohama, where they've been living for some years. The elder of their 2 girls, Joyce, will probably come to Australia to school on her parents' return to Japan and will make her home with her grandmother, Mrs. Brandon Usher. On the 23rd of June 1922, in the Wagga Wagga Daily Advertiser, at an artistically decorated table in the Winter Garden of the Hotel Australia, Mrs. Fred Shipman gave a most enjoyable tea party in honour of Mrs. Simpson Bakey, whose music lovers will remember as the well-known pianist Constance Brandon Usher. Captain and Mrs. Simpson Bakey arrived from their home in Yokohama some weeks ago to visit Mrs. Simpson Bakey's mother, Mrs. Brandon Usher, and during their stay they have been very much feted. Edwin Bakey Simpson died in 1923, leaving Constance widowed at the age of 38. His obituary reads, by private cable, the news of the recent death of Captain Edwin Bakey Simpson at Yokohama has been received in Sydney. Captain Simpson Bakey was well known in Australian shipping circles. For many years he commanded different vessels of the Eastern and Australian Line, running from Melbourne and Sydney to China and Japan. Prior to taking up a post in the East, he was in charge of the well-known Eastern steamer St Albans and one esteem of all passengers who travelled on the vessels. For some years past, Captain Simpson Bakey has been a surveyor to Lloyd's at Yokohama, and about 6 months ago he paid a short visit to Sydney on a health tour. His widow is well known in Sydney, being Miss Constance Brandon Usher before her marriage. And on the 16th of September 1923 in the Sydney Sun. With the news of the awful happenings in Japan, many people were instantly concerned as to the whereabouts of Mrs. Simpson Bakey, who's better known to us as Connie Brandon Usher. With her husband and children, she holidayed in Australia last year, and just after returning to Yokohama, her husband died quite suddenly. There was word of Mrs. Bakey returning to Sydney, but eventually she decided to stay in Japan, where she's been living for about 10 years. Word came through on Saturday last that the small family was safe, but the home in Yokohama had disappeared with the rest of the houses. On the 14th of October 1923 in the Sydney Sun, the Yokohama horror hit Mrs. Simpson Bakey, Connie Brandon Usher, so badly she's literally homeless. The yawning chasm that swallowed up the whole region of the city took to her house on the bluff, her pianos, her priceless scores of music, and a 10-year collection of Eastern treasures, including ivory, jade, cloisonne and embroideries, the like that she'll not see again. She had intended to remain in Yokohama since the death of Captain Simpson Bakey, but she's now cable to say, "I am coming home with the children," and small daughter Joyce is already on her way. The call of the East is a pretty insistent one, and the majority heed it whatever befalls. But hospitable Australia is better than a blighted spot that has taken toll of all one holds nearest and dearest. Connie married Amos Paul Brown on the 6th of November 1925 at the Kobe Municipal Office in Japan. He was born on the 7th of July 1892 in Wilmington, Newcastle, Delaware, USA, and was 3 years younger than Constance. On the 23rd of April 1933 in the Sydney Sun, it says, "Do you want to know what it feels like to experience the tail end of a typhoon, a monsoon, and a gyra, that is earthquake?" During Mrs. Crawford Robertson's tour, she had dinner at Kobe with Mrs. Paul Brown, who was formerly Connie Usher at Sydney. And on the 13th of April 1938 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, Sydney friends were pleased to welcome Mrs. Paul Brown, who with her husband arrived from Kobe last week to see Mrs. Brown's mother, Mrs. Brandon Usher. Mrs. Brown is well remembered in musical circles as Constance Brandon Usher, a well-known pianist. Her son, I'm told, inherits his mother's talent and shows promise of becoming a gifted musician. Mrs. Brown is a sister to Mrs. Douglas Gilchrist of Sydney, and her husband will sail for the US via New Zealand. In her later years, Connie emigrated to the US with her husband, and they resided in Newcastle, Delaware, in the 1950 census. Connie passed away on the 19th of July 1959 in Wilmington at the age of 74. By modelling high-level execution and curating diverse programs, she inspired female participation in classical performance and contributed to the professionalisation of piano artistry in Australia. Her children, her firstborn Joyce Constance Dorothy Bakey Simpson, who was born on the 29th of December 1910 in Sydney, had her return from Japan to Australia announced on the 11th of December 1923 in the Murwillumbah Daily. Buried in Ruins, Earthquake Experiences, a Sydney Girl's Story. I rushed to the door of the house in which I had been playing with my little brother. I saw our home next door tremble for a moment. With a cry of horror, I rushed towards it. Mother was somewhere among the ruins. And so little Joyce Simpson Bakey described her feelings when the earthquake shattered Yokohama. She's returned to Sydney to tell the vivid story of her experiences. For 8 years, Joyce has lived in Japan. Her father died last March, and her mother will be remembered in Sydney as Miss Constance Brandon Usher and has been teaching music in Yokohama. At midday on the 1st of September, said Joyce, Mother was giving a lesson to the daughter of the Cuban consul. My brother and I were playing next door when the earthquake came. A neighbour grabbed my brother and I ran to the doorway. Everything was shaking violently, and as I looked out I saw our house fall. Mother was somewhere among the ruins, and I was half mad with fear she should have been killed. I shouted and got no reply. I shouted and then I saw her alive, but beneath the ruins. I tried to pull her out, but I was not strong enough. One of the housemaids at the time of the earthquake was in the pantry and had reached the open before the house fell and came to my assistance, and we managed to get Mother out. Her pupil had fortunately reached the open, but a cook who was in the basement at the time was killed by the fall of 4 foundation stones. We went up to an open space and watched our house burn. Then we made our way to Bluff Gardens and had to climb over ruined houses, all the way, the fire chasing us. We had nothing to eat and no money to buy anything. If we had been able to do so, The only clothes we had were those what we stood in. At 7 p.m, the Bluff Gardens caught fire. A very excited foreigner was running around telling people that if they went to the harbour front, they could get aboard the Empress of Australia. Ordinarily, from where we were to the wharf was only a 10-minute walk, but it took us 2 hours to make our way there. Fires were across the streets in many parts, and we were unable to go onto the pier. When we did reach our destination, it too was alight. However, a lifeboat was sent for us and we were taken aboard. We were wonderfully well treated. Hundreds of Japanese were burnt as they swam about the harbour trying to escape. The harbour was ablaze and the Empress of Australia was towed into the stream. By 4 p.m, the doctor on board had performed over 300 operations for broken limbs. From the steamer we saw Yokohama in flames. It was impressive but terrifying. Later, the refugees of the Empress of Australia were transferred to the Empress of Canada, which had come from Kobe. Joyce, who's only 12, travelled to Sydney by herself. Her mother remained in Kobe to settle her business affairs. Joyce fears that everything has been lost and is terribly upset about the destruction of an almost priceless collection of china and curios. In 1935, Joyce was living in Canada. She married Edward B. Steele, who was English and 5 years older than Joyce. They had 2 children. Son Peter was born in Canada in 1935. In 1939, they were living in Glendale, Los Angeles, California, where Edward was working as a radio artist. In 1948, they were living at Wilmington, Delaware, where Edward was working as an auditor. Joyce died in February 1981 at Wilmington, Delaware, aged 70. Connie's son, William Magnus Simpson Bakey, was born on the 27th of February 1917 in Japan. He arrived in Canada from Japan on the 29th of October 1926 to study. He married Helen Meera Greenway, who was born in Pakistan. Helen's father, Alan Greenway, was the 3rd generation to be born in India. Helen's mother was a Russian, Vera Karbad, and Alan Greenway was a doctor in India. In 1954, Helen was living at Nedlands, Western Australia, with her parents, where Alan was a medical practitioner. Then Helen's parents emigrated to Canada in the 1960s. They had 2 children. In May 1950, William arrived in New York from Malaysia. They lived in Canada in 1957, where he worked as a salesman, and he died on the 12th of August 1966 in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, aged only 49. And now to Beatrice Cottier Usher, who was born in 1889 in Waverley, New South Wales. The first article mentioning her talents was on the 21st of May 1904 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph. Tonight at the Lyceum Theatre, the players will produce, by arrangement with Mr. Robert Brow, the 4-act play The Physician. Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher will play Edana. Then on the 8th of July 1904, in the Sydney Morning Herald, Charlie's Aunt featured and Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher was amongst the characters. On the 9th of September 1908, in the Sydney Mail and New South Wales Advertiser, Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher left Sydney last week to play Mrs. Clarence in A Message from Mars with the H.R. Roberts Company in Western Australia. On the 30th of September 1906, Miss Beatrice Usher is appearing as Lady Mabel Wingate in The Squaw Man at Her Majesty's. Then on the 14th of March 1908 in the Adelaide Register. At the Theatre Royal, Confusion, and Miss Beatrice Usher is listed as part of the company. And it says that Miss Beatrice Usher was a fresh, natural voice. On the 27th of June 1908 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, it says at the Criterion Theatre, Arthur Adams's original 4-act comedy The Tame Cat, and the cast included Miss Beatrice Usher as a winsome figure who realised the tender shrinking plant of her own description and spoke her lines with a soft inflection. She was tall, graceful, handsome, and looked charming right through the 4 acts, and no doubt followed it up with much success in the interludes. On the 30th of August 1908 in the Sydney Sunday Sun, a promising young actress. Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher will be long remembered for her beautiful portrayal of the wedded in the tableau vivante at the hospice ball arranged by Mrs. J.C. Williamson. Miss Usher left Sydney a few days ago for Melbourne to join the Prince Chap Company, having been especially engaged to play Mrs. Clarence in A Message from Mars. On the 9th of September 1908, it says that Beatrice Brandon Usher left Sydney last week to play Mrs. Clarence in A Message from Mars with H.R. Roberts Company in Western Australia. On the 12th of November 1908 in the Goulburn Evening Penny Post, While the circle was very poorly patronised, there was a good downstairs house at the Oddfellows Hall on Wednesday evening when The Message from Mars, a comedy drama splendidly staged by the Prince Chap Company, performed. The principal characters, and Beatrice Usher is listed as one of them. On the 30th of January 1909 in the Sydney Morning Herald, Alan Hamilton's new company. For the new dramatic company he has just formed to tour Australia-Asia, Mr. Alan Hamilton has secured the services of George Cross as a leading man, and then there's others listed, and then it says, and Miss Beatrice Usher. The first production at the Palais Theatre on the 3rd of April will be The Queen of the Night, a melodrama that's been running successfully in the English provinces for 3 years. On the 23rd of October 1909, in the Australian paper for Australian people in Sydney, it says Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher, a dainty and talented theatrical, has met with great success in the dramatic company of Mr. Alan Hamilton. Miss Brandon Usher is a Sydney beauty and the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Brandon Usher and the sister of Miss Constance Brandon Usher. On the 23rd of October 1909, in the Australian paper for Australian people of Sydney, it says 4 of Sydney's most beautiful girls. And Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher is one of those girls. On the 11th of September 1910 in the Sydney Sunday Sun, a clever young Sydney actress, Miss Brandon Usher, has played with the Tittlebroon Scoreman, Julius Knight and Alan Hamilton's Message from Mars companies. She made a reappearance in the Theatre Royal last night as Molly Measley in the new play Lover's Lane. Then on the 6th of May 1911 in the Perth Western Mail, Miss Beatrice Usher of the Plymouth Denniston Company, now appearing at Her Majesty's Theatre. And on the 5th of December 1911, in the Darling Downs Gazette of Queensland, Miss Beatrice Usher and Mr. A.E. Greenaway in Nobody's Daughter, to be produced by the Plymouth Denniston Company at the Town Hall Tuesday evening. On the 17th of December 1911 in the Sydney Sunday Times, the Hamilton, Plymouth and Denniston Company will open their Christmas season at the Palace Theatre next Saturday night with Inconsistent George. At the Palace, the principal characters will be taken by, and Miss Beatrice Usher is amongst them. And on the 17th of June 1912, in the Kalgoorlie Minor of Western Australia at the Boulder Town Hall, Plymouth Denniston Company, a village priest. The Plymouth Denniston Dramatic Company opened a 3-night season at the Boulder Town Hall last night, when a village priest was presented to a large audience. This is one of the most popular plays in the company's fine repertoire, and the audience followed its 5 acts with rapt attention. Miss Beatrice Usher played Marguerite de Tremolin. On the 23rd of January 1913 in Melbourne Punch, it announced the engagement of Mr. Douglas Gilchrist, eldest son of Mr. John Gilchrist of Sydney, and Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher, younger daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Alfred Brandon Usher of Rocklands, Waverley, Sydney. And on the 13th of March 1913, in the Melbourne Punch, it had an article about the wedding in Sydney of Mr. D. Gilchrist and Miss B. Brandon Usher. Mr. Douglas Gilchrist and Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher were married at St Mary's Church of England on Tuesday the 4th of March. The wedding was very quiet owing to the bridegroom's family being in mourning. The reception was at the home of the bride's parents. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Gilchrist left for Avoca, where they will spend a few days prior to their departure for Europe. Many handsome presents were received. And on the 12th of October 1913 in the Sydney Sun, Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Gilchrist, Miss Beatrice Brandon Usher, have been honeymooning in Europe since last March and write from Venice that they intend to return to Sydney next month. They will be the guests of Mrs. Brandon Usher at Rocklands, Waverley until after Christmas, when they will take up their residence in Western Australia. Beatrice gave birth to a son, John Alfred Gilchrist, on the 28th of February 1916 in Sydney, and another son, Colin Douglas Gilchrist, was born in Sydney on the 1st of January 1918. On the 9th of August 1925, in a Perth paper, Mrs. E. Douglas Gilchrist, who with her husband, the popular local manager of R.W. Cameron & Co., was the guest of the Repertory Club on Friday afternoon. Both Mr. and Mrs. Gilchrist leave shortly for Melbourne after several years' residence in Perth and have been indefatigable workers in local amateur dramatic circles, particularly in connection with the productions of the Repertory Club. It is largely due to Mr. Gilchrist's efforts that the club occupies the progressive position it enjoys today. They'll be greatly missed by a large circle of friends. And on the 18th of September 1925, in the Prahran Telegraph, it says that Mr. and Mrs. Douglas Gilchrist of Perth, Western Australia, and their 2 sons are staying at Ingalara in Domain Road, South Yarra. By 1928, they're living at The Warren in Adams Street, South Yarra, and Ernest is listed as a manager. On the 24th of January 1933, in the Melbourne Sun News pictorial, says that Mr and Mrs Douglas Gilchrist have returned to Sydney after a holiday in Melbourne. In 1934, they are living in Rose Bay, where Ernest is working as a broker. Ernest died in 1937, and his death was announced on the 20th of December 1937 in the Sydney Morning Herald. The death occurred on Saturday of Mr E. Douglas Gilchrist, the youngest son of the late Mr and Mrs John Gilchrist of Sydney. Born in 1884, he was educated at Sydney Grammar School. In 1919, he went to Western Australia, where for 7 years he was in charge of the Perth branch of R.W. Cameron and Company. He later took charge of the Melbourne office of the firm and then returned to Sydney in 1930, where he practiced as an insurance broker. Mrs Gilchrist and 2 sons, John and Colin, survive him. And Beatrice died on the 4th of April 1978 at Vaucluse, New South Wales. Their 2 sons, John Alfred Gilchrist, was born on the 28th of February 1916 in Sydney. He served in World War II, and on the 14th of July 1943 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it announced his engagement to Section Officer Betty Crichton Brown of the Women's Air Force, eldest daughter of Mr and Mrs L. Crichton Brown of Strathfield, New South Wales. To Captain John Alfred Gilchrist, returned from AIF, eldest son of the late E. Douglas Gilchrist and Mrs Gilchrist of Vaucluse. And on the 4th of August 1943 in the Sydney Morning Herald, it announced their marriage in the paper on July the 29th at St Stephen's Church in Sydney. Betty Crichton Brown, the eldest daughter of Mr and Mrs Leslie Crichton Brown of Strathfield, to Captain John Alfred Gilchrist, returned AIF, eldest son of Mrs E. Douglas Gilchrist of Vaucluse and the late Mr Gilchrist. Betty passed away on the 15th of April 1946 at Wahroonga. She was only 28, and in the memorials it mentions that they had a little son, Johnny. John then married Barbara Arlene Marjorie Fairfax on the 12th of June 1948 at Darling Point in New South Wales. They had a son, and his birth was announced in the Daily Telegraph of Sydney on the 27th of March 1949. John and Barbara Gilchrist of Vaucluse are the proud parents of a son born this week at St Luke's Hospital. Barbara is the daughter of the John Fairfaxes of Double Bay. They had a further 2 children. In August 1948, John Alfred Gilchrist is listed as receiving the rank of Major, Temporary Lieutenant Colonel with the Royal Australian Engineers, and in 1971 he became a Brigadier. In 1980, they're listed in the census as living at Vaucluse. John is listed as a builder, and he died on the 25th of April 2012 at Narrabeen, New South Wales at the age of 96. His brother Colin Douglas Gilchrist was born on the 1st of January 1918 in Sydney. He enlisted in the Navy on the 1st of August 1940 and was demobilised in December 1945. Whilst in the Navy, is listed in the 1943 census as living at Vaucluse with his mother at Jugiong, Ashgate Avenue in Rose Bay, and he was a clerk. Colin then became a missionary, and in 1948 he was up in the Northern Territory at Nooka, which is a remote Aboriginal community in Arnhem Land. He married Jane Bertha Stevenson Munro, who had been born in 1924 in Japan. On the 7th of April 1954 in the Fairfield Broadcaster, it mentions that Mr Colin Gilchrist, Superintendent of the Church Missionary Society's Roper River Station in the Northern Territory, showed fine coloured films of the work there at a fellowship tea on the 28th of March. He also preached at evening prayer. On the 25th of November 1954 in the Camden News, it says it's expected that Mr Colin Gilchrist, a keen missionary from the north of Australia who has intimate knowledge of the Aborigines, will be at St Mark's Church next Sunday night. He'll illustrate his talk with helpful pictures. From 1959 to 1976, Colin was the superintendent at the Church Missionary Society at Numbulwar Mission. In 1977, they were living in Greystanes, New South Wales, where Colin is listed as a paymaster. Jane is listed as a clerk and a typist. And at the same address, there's Philip Allen, a clerk, and David Ian, an electrician. In 1980 at Greystanes, there also lists Paul Douglas Gilchrist, living with the family, and he's an apprentice carpenter. So their children were David, Philip, Anne, Paul, and Gisela. Colin died on the 4th of September 1987 at Merrylands, New South Wales at the age of 69. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about the Usher sisters, who seem to be quite notable young ladies on the musical and theatre scene back in the day.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.